So, quick who am I? My name is Tierney Cyren. My pronouns are they and them. I'm a core contributor on Node.js. I've also done a lot of other things in Node. I used to chair the community committee. I've been part of the security working group, done a lot of stuff in Node over the years. I'm also part of outreach in Electron, and I'm a principal developer advocate at Twilio. So, tests for Node.js. Let's talk about tests until now, and then we'll get into testing kind of in the future with, subject of this talk. So, there's been a pretty big ecosystem, and I want to kind of talk about that first. And frankly, we've had a lot of options. So Mocha, that's what I've primarily used over the years. Works really well, does what it should. There's Tap, which is a very old testing framework. That one existed, I believe, first in October 2011, so about 2 years after Node came out, and 12 years ago. So it's been around for a long time, built by Isaac, who made NPM. There's Tape, which is kind of an evolution of Tap and has some additional DX features on it. And there's Jest, which I'm sure most people here are very familiar with. It has really good DX, works pretty well with React, Vue, et cetera. But when you're trying to use it with Node, there's kind of a problem. This specific issue is a problem. Jest actually changes globals, and that can be pretty problematic when you're trying to do testing with Node. It can break in some ways that are not obvious and give you a lot of red herrings, a lot of misdirection. So yeah, in general, I don't suggest using Jest, and most of the people I know in Node Core, most of the testing people I know also don't suggest using Jest because of this specific issue that has been marked as not going to be solved. There's a bunch of other frameworks, right? The ones I mentioned, and then Vitest and Ava and a bunch of others, and there's plenty others that aren't on this slide as well. They're all good. They all do the thing, right? Testing is pretty simple when you kind of get to it. You're trying to check your code, make sure it works. All of these work. They're all good. The ecosystem is kind of saturated, actually. We've got so many options for testing. So what if we added another, right? Who doesn't love more tools? And specifically, Node has actually added Node Test. I want to insert the obligatory XKCD 927. We had 14 standards, now we have 15. But it's not quite like that. It's not actually a new standard. It's very similar to what already exists. As I understand it, Node Test is built specifically to work very well. So it's built to be very minimal. It's not built to do kind of the more extreme things or the more niche use cases. It's built to serve the 90% of use cases, and the 10 additional percent that are more extreme, probably not going to be perfect for that. But it's built based off of experience from maintainers across the ecosystem. So the person who is the current maintainer of Mocha has done a bunch of work contributing to it. And then Colin Uhrig has also done a bunch of work. He's worked across the ecosystem on a bunch of different developer tools as well. And it adopts a few common patterns that, if you've used another testing tool, you'll be familiar with. If you've not used another testing tool, this is a great way to learn it, because then you'll be familiar with the patterns in the other tools. It specifically also doesn't try to do more than it needs to. It really tries to just give you the tools you need and get out of the way. It's not trying to be flashy. It's not trying to do a ton of extra work. It's really trying to just kind of give you the minimum set of what you need to get testing and get off the ground. Specifically, it actually does use Tap currently. It's not using Tap the module. Tap is actually a protocol, the test anything protocol. That's where the name comes from. This is the URL for the website. It's a pretty interesting protocol. It's actually built off of the original, the first Perl testing script, which is not something I would have guessed even Isaac would have gone for, but it's pretty interesting. There's a lot of history there. It's also used across different ecosystems. probably less frequently than like more platform-specific tools, but it is available in a bunch of different ecosystems. And there's a bunch of different people who've contributed to it, so it's a pretty well-established tool at this point. So it makes sense that Node would adopt this and kind of build off of that success. Here's what tap output looks like. It's not super pretty, but before we get too deep here, let's actually back it up a bit and look at how to use Node test. So this is common import, very basic. It does work with CJS and ESM. So if you're looking to kind of modernize and move into ESM in the modern world, you can use Node and ESM to test your stuff. It's a pretty nice time that it's built with that from the beginning. Yeah, and you can choose whichever you're comfortable with. One of the projects I actually used or was building it with, I ended up running the CJS version because I prefer writing CJS, but I was running, it's an ESM app, so it was interesting to be able to kind of intermix those with the .cjs file extension for the tests. One thing to note is when you're requiring it, you must use node:test. So with a lot of other modules in Node, you can use require HTTP, but with this, you specifically have to use node:test to import it from the runtime. And that specific part's important. We'll get into that a bit later. But yeah, that's a new kind of paradigm that's in Node. You can import any module with the node: prefix. That just tells it to definitely get it from the runtime and nowhere else. Yeah, you can call it a test, but again, we'll get into that a little bit later. So once we've imported the module, now what are we going to do? You're probably going to also want an assertion library. I personally just use Node's assertion library. I learned today that Jest actually has a pretty amazing assertion library. So yeah, I would definitely check that out as well. But for me, for most of my use cases, Node's built-in assert works just as does what I need it to do. So there's an example, again, just doing normal requires from Node's modules. From here on out, I'm going to use CJS only. That font does not work well for code beyond 2 lines. And it also, yeah, I prefer CJS, so that's what I'm going to use. So here's a very basic example. You can see that I'm actually doing that same import, pulling in test, pulling in assert, and then also calling the module. So the module itself, the most basic usage of it, you call test, you pass it a string, you pass it a function. You can also pass it a set of options between, or an object that is a set of options between those two. I'm not going to be going into that in this talk, but there's pretty good documentation for it. Very basic testing stuff, right? Yeah, so here's what the output is of that. Pretty basic. We have one test. It passed. There's no failures, no canceled, no skipped, no to-do. It works, right? It does the testing thing. I'm very happy about that. It works. So that worked well, but it is basic. I also like to have a little bit of a better developer experience in my tests. The first time I picked this up, it didn't really work how I wanted it to. It was a little bit clunky. Yeah, and so I actually went back to the documentation at that point and was like, okay, what can I use like the things I'm familiar with from other testing libraries? And they actually do have all of the methods that I would expect coming from Mocha or from Jest. So it's describe it before, after each, after each. Those are the ones I generally end up relying on the most, but they're all there. So let's rewrite that example a bit to use describe and it. So yeah, for reference, here's that example initially, and then here it is rewritten with describe and it. You'll notice the real big difference is that there's one more kind of description. Describe is generally a good tool to collect a bunch of different tests that are similar, that fall under a category, and then it is those individual tests. So in this example, we're doing testing stuff, and then the it is that true should be true. That's the deep strict equal that we're doing here. Pretty basic, but again, this is the more useful basic example to me. I can generally read this style better, and yeah, it's a good approach. So again, describe is a set of tests, and I prefer that you can do this with just the test structure. It just gets more verbose and a little bit uglier in my opinion. And I try to kind of have my tests get out of my way as much as possible. And again, it is an individual test that you're running. Should have a very narrow scope, and this specific structure has allowed me to be much more granular and kind of be able to read my tests a lot better. It's also super familiar coming from just a Mocha. This is what I've used in both of those for every module I've used them with. So it's good. Let's look at some code, though. So I'm actually going to, that's the very basic end. Now I'm going to show you some of my personal code. So let's exit out of here and do this. Let's see here. There we go. I always drag up to full screen, and sometimes that bites me. OK. Oh, boy, that's slow. Yeah. OK, cool. So this is one of my modules. It's Node version utility. It goes and fetches data from the Node website, from like dist/index.json. And then that has like a bunch of version utility, version information. And it also fetches some data from GitHub from the release repo. So here's the core package. In here, this is like does all the networking and stuff. And here's the test directory. I have 5 test files that each kind of have their own kind of structure. I'm going to mostly go over this one. So again, you can see here that I have assert requiring node assert, and then describe it and before each being directly required. You'll notice here that I am using test. Again, we'll get to that in a minute, rather than node:test. I also have a before each template, and this is basically just setting up my mocking. So it's pulling in Node DNS and the mock agent and global dispatcher from Undici. Undici is a kind of borderline replacement for HTTP in Node, and it will eventually replace HTTP in Node, but for now it's just under the Node project, and you can directly require it. It's also responsible for like fetch in Node. Setting up static index and static schedule, which are the statically generated files that I fetched at some point in the past, but not currently, because I don't want this to reach out over the network. So these are just like the data I pulled at one point. And then this is actually a bug in Node that I have to set this to fix. I think I can delete it now, but I don't need to, because it still works. Setting up my mock agent from Undici, and then just basically mocking out the responses to each of these URLs. I use these for, the first two here, the Node.js.org and raw GitHub user content, are the data I normally fetch, and then just replying with that static data. And then these two at the bottom here, these are, I have a configuration that allows you to swap those URLs out. So yeah, that ends up getting run before each template. Or before each test, so you can see here, I'm describing, basically that this test suite goes through all the different kind of potential configuration options and runs the code. This function up here just checks some known data, and so I'm pretty comfortable just running that in each one. So I set that up as a function. And each test specifically just goes and checks that data and makes sure it's getting returned and not getting, mangled somehow. So each of these tests a different option. So pretty basic. Again, it's just usage of assert, describe, it, and before each. I do particularly like that before each exists rather than just having to do before in every test, which is exceptionally helpful. Here's another test. Again, assert, describe, it, before each. And pulling in the before each template. I don't think in this file it's actually necessary, but it's there. And then pulling in some timestamps that I statically built from when I fetched that data originally, and then setting it up as an actual data object. And then again, just describing the test. This one checks that the data is actually kind of valid. So because the data changes over time, this one specifically goes through and checks that, like, okay, this is like at a sensible state, and there's not like newer data that we need to fetch. And so that's a pretty basic one. Again, it's just doing assert, describe it, and before each. It's very simple. And again, here, you're probably noticing a pattern: assert, describe it, before each. That is all I need for this package. It has been exceptionally useful, and it was pretty easy to set up. This stuff got out of my way. I was able to go through and build these tests out without having to think too hard about it. And really, I was able to mostly focus on actually checking the data that is coming in from my app, which, having this built into Node Core is so handy. So that's the code. It really does amaze me how simple it was to kind of get going with this and swap over to this from Mocha. I believe these tests were actually originally written in Mocha, and it was a very simple swap to come over to this. The mocking was a bit more complex because of that bug, but otherwise it was very straightforward. Okay, cool. So back to the slides. Okay, so let's step back and look at this as a new toy for Node developers. And I'm not talking about toy in the sense of like it being bad. I'm talking about a toy in the sense of like it's something new that we get to enjoy and have fun with. It doesn't mean that this can't be used for production. It's more that this is a nice new thing that's in the standard library that is usable by most people who are using JavaScript in Node, or at least building a module that is Node only rather than like a front-end app. And we can have fun as it's being built. I don't know why that's not working. So Node test is doing some unique stuff in the context of Node, right? We don't get a ton of new like standard library additions to Node, often especially not ones that are broadly applicable, or broadly usable. Quick show of hands here. How many of you are familiar with readable stream? Cool. So like 15, 20 people. Okay, cool. So readable stream is definitely in every single person here in your Node modules. I guarantee it is. It's at 115 million downloads weekly, which is putting it in the top 3, I think, maybe top 5, but I'm pretty sure top 3 packages in the world. Basically, every developer tool uses it. It's one of the biggest modules on NPM. It's also a part of Node Core. Specifically, it's a part that is, versioned with Node. And when you're using something that you need to rely on over time, having something versioned with the runtime makes it a little bit more challenging to actually consume and have like consistency, because depending on what your users are using, the version of the module might change over time, and that's not really like a good way to build a reliable application. So like, if Webpack's using this, they probably want to pin to a version rather than using what's in Node Core. And in my opinion, this is a really good approach to building modules for the ecosystem that are in Node Core. And that's kind of why you saw test rather than node test earlier. Test is actually a module on NPM. We had this donated to us, the name. So I don't remember who it was, but I really appreciate them donating it to us. It's been stagnant for years. The test package from Node Core is actually available as the test module on NPM. And you can set this as a dependency, hopefully a dev dependency. I hope you're not using this in production, or like for production dependency. But you can download it from NPM and have it, pin it to your application, right? So there's a bunch of different reasons you'd want to do that. It's, in my opinion, a really smart approach to doing this. It allows a lot of reliability for your testing. So say you have 500 Node apps across your org, and you want consistency across the testing, right? You don't want to have developers having to jump around and figure out different features, or which one has a bug. Since this is a new feature, there's going to be bugs. It allows you to pin to a version and have consistency with that, and that's really useful, especially this early. It also allows a good migration path. So Node test shipped in Node 18 as experimental, and then it's stable in Node 20. That means that Node 16 is still supported, but doesn't actually have this. So you can use this in your apps in Node 16. I know a lot of people end up being on like Node 16 and they upgrade when it dies. They upgrade the oldest LTS when it dies. That's a very common pattern. Please don't do that, but you probably are. Yeah, so this is a way that you can start using this as a testing framework now, and eventually, over time, when you upgrade to Node 18 and then Node 20, when you're on Node 20, you can eventually just remove the dependency, and you can have it directly from the runtime itself, right? So that's a really good way to progressively enhance your testing framework, which is really cool, in my opinion. And then it also just allows you to have a little bit more stability when you're migrating node majors, actually. So say we're on node 24, we're on node 20, we're on node 30, but you're still stuck on 24, and you're like, okay, we need to move up to 26. It allows you to say, okay, cool, we're gonna do a code mod, change all our tests to use the module, and then that allows our tests to be stable while we're doing this migration, and then you undo that code mod once you're ready to kind of deal with the new things that came in the new version. So yeah, it's a really good way to kind of give a lot more flexibility, and I think for testing especially, you need that flexibility to be able to kind of survive. So Node test is growing really fast. I don't know if any of you noticed in my code, I think it was a little bit too zoomed in, but I wrote all those tests I transitioned them to Node test in about 8 months ago. That's really old in JavaScript years. But yeah, on my flight over, I actually ran the very first example, well, the second example, the one with describe init. I ran that with Node 20, because I NVM installed Node 20.2, because that just came out. And this was the output. You'll notice that this is very different than that first slide I showed you. In Node 20, I think when it went stable, they changed how it's prettified. I like it. It's green, and there's a check mark, and it's blue, and I like colors. So this is a much nicer DX, in my opinion. But I was not expecting that. It was a bit of a jump scare on the plane, I'm not going to lie. Yeah, so I've been using this for 8 months, and to see this all of a sudden was very surprising. And it's because in that example, I actually used Node test rather than using test that was in that project. But yeah, so this is this is the old example, right? It's very, very different. So I actually went to the changelog for Node 20.2 and saw this. There's 4 changes in just 20.2 in that minor. That semver minor change is relatively hard to read, but the ones without a semver minor prefix are all patch changes. They could have gone into 20.1.1. But that semver minor one's interesting. Also, congrats to Phil Nash on his first PR into Node, and specifically having it be the test runner. I think that's really cool. If anyone here wants to start contributing to that, I'm happy to help get you up and running with that. But I didn't really see anything here that was explaining why that changed. I think it's probably the v8.serialize instead of tap, although I'm not sure. That seems like an interesting major change in a minor. But then I went to 20.1, and there's 11 changes. So this is happening really quick. There's a lot of work going into this, a lot of bug fixes, a lot of features, a lot of performance improvements. It's really cool to see this. I'm really happy to see this velocity and something that is so widespread, so useful for so many people in Node. It's rare that we get to see these big additions because a lot of it's been solved already, or it's been chosen that the problem will be solved in the ecosystem rather than the project. So I'm really excited about this, and I think it's really cool. That semver major in 20.2.0, the one with 4 changes, actually added test.skip, test.todo, and test.only. So you can just import skip, to do, or only in the same way as importing describe or it. And that kind of is a nice DX enhancement, right? And that's just coming out in a minor. I think that's really cool. These features were available, but you had to pass them in through options on the test method. So it's really nice to see that kind of feature set expanding and the DX improving here pretty aggressively. The PR, I went and looked at the PR, the semver minor PR, that added this, and it was opened a week before 20.2 was released. So this is going really, really quick. Yeah, it's going fast. It's a good tool. It's usable for production. I'm pretty sure that my app, or my module, NodeView, is probably the largest test or node test user at this point. There's like 7 modules there that I'll use and have pretty extensive tests. So like I'm really excited to see it growing, and I'm excited that it seems to be really usable to me. And that module is actually getting used in the Node.js website now for building out some of the information. So it's really cool to also see that being used in production, and it being tested in production. And it is backwards compatible with the module, right? So you can start using it on whatever version you're on. Probably not 12, and probably not 14. Please don't use those. But yeah, one thing at a time. That's about it. But one last thing. Please go follow Colin wherever. If you use Twitter, if you use GitHub, follow him there. He is the reason this exists. He posted a tweet like a year ago of, hey, we should have a test runner in Node. Then he went and built it, and then he went and improved it. He is the only reason this exists. I mean, there's a bunch of people who've contributed to it, but his initiative was really helpful, and I'm really, really thankful to him. He's also interested in giving talks about this. If you're running a conference, he will absolutely be happy to talk about it. Yeah, I cannot thank him enough. It's a really cool tool, and I'm really excited for it. Thank you.